Hello YouTube, welcome back to the Easy Prepping channel with your old Uncle Carl here. Today I'd like to do, the third video in my firearms and ammunition series. And today I'd like to discuss the three types of firearms that I think every prepper, just every household, I think should have, just for basic self-defense. Now, before we get into the types of firearms, I want to go over safety, the rules of firearm safety. First, always treat a firearm as if it's loaded. That's even if you just check 20 times that firearm's not loaded, still treat it as if it is. Just get in that habit. And next, always point in a safe direction, whether loaded or not. Never point the firearm at something you wouldn't want to shoot. And next, we have keep your finger off the trigger until you're absolutely ready, pointed downrange, ready to fire. An example of that, if you ever watch people that know how to handle a firearm, their finger will be up here along the edge of the firearm until they're ready to shoot. This firearm is unloaded. If you know anything about revolvers, there's no rounds in there. But I still treat it as if it's loaded. Even when I set it down, I make sure the barrel is pointed away from me and anybody else that happens to be around. Next, know your target and what's behind it. These bullets are moving at a pretty good velocity, and there's a chance they're going to go through the target and onto what's behind it, especially if you're just target shooting at paper. What I typically use at my range, we stand up some pallets and we put targets on them. I've got some pallets up there that are pretty shot up, but the round does go on beyond. And at my firing range, I happen to be lucky enough to have one here on my property. I've got enough I'm out in the country. There's not a snowball's chance in hell that bullet is leaving my property. It will stop before. In other words, I'm not endangering anybody that, shouldn't be here anyway. And next, I'd like to get into the three main types of firearms, and one I think each prepper should have, one of each. First, I think the top priority, if you don't have any firearms and can only afford one, a shotgun. Next would be a handgun, and after that, a rifle. Now, I'm going to go into some more detail on each type, but still, this is pretty much just an overview. If you want more detail, there are thousands upon thousands of YouTube videos out there that can give you instruction on any type of firearm and go into more detail. And I can tell you that just about every firearm that I own, I learned how to do the field strip, clean, lubricate, reassemble on YouTube videos. And now a brief overview of shotguns. The rounds you load in a shotgun come in what's called a gauge. The smaller the number, the bigger a round, and therefore the more powerful the firearm. Most common out there is 12 gauge. That's by far the most common. Beyond that, you have 20 gauge, 28 gauge, and then there's 410, which I happen to have an example of sitting here. Reason being, I will get to later with you. But the next thing about shotguns, most important if you're looking, is barrel length. Typically for hunting, you want a longer barrel. Normally they can run about a 28 inch, it may be as much as 30. But in shotguns, the shorter the barrel, the quicker the shot will spread out. An example might be if you're shooting double-aught buck, which I'd recommend as a home defense type round. In a 28-inch barrel at 20 feet, you're probably going to leave a pattern pretty tight, close in. If you shorten that and put the same round in a 16-inch barrel, the spread's going to be bigger. Another advantage of having a shorter barrel for home defense is if you're maneuvering around your house, defending your house, a longer barrel is just going to be, in the way. you're going to be hitting walls and furniture and whatever else. A shorter barrel will be more maneuverable. And one thing I forgot to mention about controlling the pattern, how fast it spreads out, is some barrels have a different choke, it's called, where you could close in the end of the barrel more and therefore keep the shot pattern tighter. Main thing to be careful of here, you do not want to close in the end of your barrel and then fire what's called a slug. It is a solid piece of lead that is the same diameter as the inside of the barrel. And you don't want the end of the barrel being too small. So, quick safety advice there. Be careful when you're shooting a slug and what type of choke you have on your barrel. Next, I'd like to bring up two different types of shotguns. They fall into two main categories. The one would be your semi-automatic, and the other would be the pump action. I know you've seen on, well, how many movies where they pump the shotgun. That action removes the spent casing and inserts the new one from the tube, the magazine. And, well, there was a time when I had to live out of town for a week or two at a time, corporate schools and things. And I left a 12 gauge there for my wife. She was afraid of guns, but I kept it empty. And what I would do is tell her, if you think somebody's in the house, say, I've got a gun, and pump that shotgun. They know that sound. Hopefully they'll leave. But that's the advantage of having a pump over a semi-automatic. Now, semi-automatics are, well, every time you pull the trigger, you fire a new round. So faster. You don't have to take time to pump the shotgun. But if you practice, there was a time way back in my Navy days, a couple hundred years ago, I shot a lot of skeet, it was called. Now, trap and skeet are two different things. They both use those little clay frisbee looking things. In skeet, you had to sometimes do 2 shots fast. And I shot so much that I got to where I could fire a pump shotgun about as fast as a normal person would fire a semi-automatic. Also with a pump, you have the advantage of if any of your rounds are slightly defective, they're not perfectly round. A semi-automatic will jam. A pump action, you got the muscle, you can go ahead and force it through, and then you're not there trying to unjam a gun. The other main difference in the semi-automatic and the pump is the semi-automatics cost more. Well, there's more mechanism to them that the round is doing from the pressure instead of you doing it manually with a pump. And I've seen some recent sales where you could get a decent pump action shotgun for as little as $150, $200 at some sites. Next, I'd like to cover with you rifles. First of all, AR-15. Boy, does it have a bad reputation. And if the government does ever get around to trying to confiscate weapons, that'll probably be the first target. But I own an AR-15. It's very good for home defense, and I like target shooting with it. It's a lot of fun. Anyway, semi-automatic, 1 fire per trigger pull. It's not a full automatic, or even called an automatic firearm rifle. To be an assault rifle, go to Google, look up the definition. It says automatic. The AR-15 is not an assault rifle. AR does not stand for assault rifle. It stands for Armalite Rifles. That's the company that first invented it, developed it. I think it was in the late 50s or very early 60s. But beyond that, 3 types of rifles. The semi-automatic, which the most famous is the AR-15 or the AK-47, which I am unfamiliar with. I'm not going to discuss it. The semi-automatic are magazine fed, and if you're going to go that route, I recommend having extra magazines. Next down the line would be the bolt action. This is what you would see normally in, well, what a country boy would call his deer rifle. It's where you have to eject the last round and insert the new one from a magazine that's underneath. Normally, magazine only holds 3-5 rounds at most. Raise the bolt all the way back, all the way forward, all the way back. I'll put some pictures up here as I go along so you can visualize what it is I'm talking about. And the next, which I really recommend is called a lever action. Think of the John Wayne movies. And I own several lever action, and you can fire not as fast as a semi-automatic, but a whole lot faster than a bolt action. And the way our government politicians are getting demonizing automatic weapons of any type, I kind of suggest you look into the lever action rifles. And next on to handguns, which I would put as the second priority for you to acquire after shotgun for home defense. Handgun would probably be the second most valuable to you in a home defense or defense situation of any type, really. Now, handguns break down also into two different categories. The first would be your semi-automatic. These are the ones you're most famous, and probably the most famous one out there is the Glock. One thing to know about Glock is the model number has absolutely nothing to do with the caliber. Most other semi-automatic firearms, the model number will tell you the caliber. An example is I own a Glock Model 22. It fires 40 caliber rounds. So that's just a basic example of Glock. Don't depend on the model. You've got to look up the model number to see what type of round it fires. Anyway, semi-automatic versus revolver. I have several examples of revolver here I'm going to show, but first I'd like to just talk about it and say that semi-automatic, although they hold more rounds, is probably the biggest advantage of them. And they're less dependable, though. If you hear about a firearm jamming, it's probably a semi-automatic. And in a jam, in a desperate situation, you could be in trouble. So then you've got no firearm. You have to stop and clear the jam. Revolvers don't jam. You could take a revolver and bury it in sand and throw mud at it and do this. It's probably still going to shoot. Semi-automatic, not so much. Disadvantage of revolvers is the limited number of rounds and the time it takes to reload. Now, just a little more detail on revolvers. You have basically two groups that they break into is double action and single action. The way I'm going to demonstrate that, this is a Smith & Wesson model 13-2, 357 chambered for, which means it also shoots 38 special. Now what I have here are called snap caps. Unless you know that your firearm is safe to shoot dry firing it's called, that's with no rounds in it. A lot of firearms, dry firing can damage the firearm, especially the firing pin. These snap caps, where the primer would be in a live round, have a little spring-loaded button there, something for the firing pin to hit that will keep it from being damaged. So to demonstrate single action and double action, I'm going to load with snap caps. All 6 rounds here. Most revolvers, 6 round is common, most common. But the snap caps in it, I can safely dry fire it to show you single and double action. First, this is a double action revolver, but I want to show you single action. The trigger does one thing. It releases the hammer to come forward. This is more in older guns. If you see a Western, you first have to cock the hammer all the way back. Oh, by the way, double action will fire in single action mode. That's what this is. It's a double action revolver, but cocking the hammer back manually. I'm firing it, demonstrating firing it in single action mode. There, single action. Cock the hammer yourself, pull the trigger. Now, double action, which is anything newer at all. This is not a new revolver, but squeezing the trigger, you also can cock the hammer by squeezing the trigger. Big disadvantage here is it takes a lot more pressure on that hammer. I mean a lot more pressure on the hammer, on the trigger, to cock the hammer. And with any firearm, the more pressure you need to put on the trigger to fire it, the less accurate you're going to be, because as you squeeze the trigger, if you have to squeeze really hard, it's going to move. So most people shoot more accurately by putting them in single action mode. And if you're shopping for a revolver, the designation is SA for single action and DA for double action. And there's one more here I brought to show you. This one is called, it's made by Smith & Wesson. It's called the Governor. And first, I want to demonstrate to you that it's in a holster. If you get a holster, which you probably would for your pistol, your handgun, make sure the holster covers the trigger. There is no way you could get to this trigger to discharge the firearm until you remove it from the holster. See, that completely covers the trigger. Now, the Smith & Wesson Governor. What I said about shotguns. This can be a shotgun. This can shoot either the 45 ACP, which is a very common round, the 45 long Colt, or the 410 shotgun shells. The ones you see here, all these rounds, are what I typically keep this loaded with when I'm out around the property. Because, first of all, this is unloaded. These are the rounds I had in it when I brought it up here. But I have two different types of 45 long cut and two different types of 410. I could take care of just about anything that might come at me out at the woods. Everything from a snake to a coyote up to, I could probably take out a bear, even though I really wouldn't want to shoot a bear. But anyway, Smith & Wesson Governor is very versatile, although kind of expensive handgun revolver. There is another one out there on the market made by a company called Taurus. They call theirs the Judge. Main difference is it only has 5 rounds you can load instead of 6 in the Governor, and it cannot shoot 45 ACP. It can only shoot 45 long Colt in the 410. But the biggest difference is this is dependable. I own a Taurus Judge. It's in a drawer in the basement. It's probably going to get sold, or I don't know. It's not dependable. Every time you load it with 5 rounds, you pull the trigger 5 times, you might get 3 or 4 bangs. It has what's called light strikes, and it's been returned to the factory. And they sent it back 6 months later and claimed that they had replaced some parts inside, some internal parts. I loaded it with 5 rounds, took it to my range. Only 4 of them went bang. The 5th was a light strike. So even after being returned from the factory, well, I'll just say that that is my first and last Taurus firearm. Spend the extra money, get something dependable. And now I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the Easy Prepping channel here if you have not already. If you found this video educational, entertaining in any way, please give me that like, thumbs up button. And today's quote, I think appropriately, is by Sun Tzu. He's the author of a book called The Art of War, is what he's most famous for. But one quote that I have here from him is, victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. In other words, be prepared. Thank you for watching.